Good evening, and welcome to this International Center of Moral Injury webinar, during which we will welcome Alison O'Connor to deliver her presentation titled Creative Approaches to Recovery and Repair After Moral Injury, Live Story Theater, and Collective Narratives. My name is Brian Powers. I'm the Executive Director of the International Center for Moral Injury, or the ICMI. As tonight's webinar resonates deeply and directly with the aims, vision, and purpose of the Center, I should just note that the ICMI is committed to producing and receiving new scholarship on moral injury, facilitating new research by building networks of academic scholars, military members, chaplains, clergy, and others with the knowledge of and experience with moral injury. The ICMI seeks to create and develop resources for counselors, caregivers, churches, and faith organizations caring for morally injured individuals. And each of these things serves the center's ultimate goal of increasing an understanding of the causes and impacts of moral injury and facilitating increased care for those experiencing it. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker for this evening, Alison O'Connor. Alison is a theater practitioner, therapist, and clinical supervisor who's worked alongside people impacted by moral injury and trauma in military veteran communities, in prisons, and in healthcare settings over the past 25 years. She's the co-founder of Relive, an arts and health charity based in the UK, which co-creates a reflective program of group work and life story theater. With co-founder and best friend Karin Diamond, she received an Arts and Health Practice Award from the Royal Society of Public Health for creative work with military families, and an award for international leadership in arts and health from Arts and Health Australia. Together with Clark Baim, Alison and Karin recently co-authored the book Creating Life Story Theater, which has just been published by Methuen Drama on 20 February 2025, so just this week. This book explores the process of co-creation with people recovering from moral injury and trauma, and shares the author's creative methodology, which integrates life review with theater, storytelling, music, comics, and film. So in light of that, Alison will offer her presentation tonight, Creative Approaches to Recovery and Repair After Moral Injury, Life Story Theater, and Collective Narratives, as an argument for the arts being integral to future developments in moral injury and moral repair. So it's my honor to welcome our friend and colleague, Alison O'Connor. Alison, I turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian. And good evening, everyone, or hello, depending where you are. Yeah, I'm really delighted to be here this evening. Just going to share my screen as I begin to speak. And just as I do that, I am reminding myself, so I'm just going to go back one moment, that I need to share my sound. So I'm going to be sharing a little video with you as part of the presentation. There we go. Okay, so welcome everyone. So pleased to have this opportunity to connect, and really grateful to Brian and Jane for the invitation. I've been passionate about moral injury since 2016, when I was first introduced to the term, to the concept, by a female military veteran in a theatre in Minneapolis, which will become clear as I tell you a little bit more. I'm incredibly grateful to her and to all of the military veterans and families that I've worked with, and the nurses, doctors, care workers, frontline professionals, and colleagues. And it's a real privilege to be sharing our collective learning about moral injury with you, particularly about the role that creativity and the arts can play in recovery and repair. So just to start by just referencing this photograph here, this opening image, which is from the Korean War. And for me, this image is a work of art. It does, I think, what the best art can do, and it conveys something that is perhaps deeper than words. And I'm also drawn to this because I think this image captures the depth of suffering that moral injury taps into. So that is sometimes called a soul wound. So that sense that the deepest part of us can be wounded and damaged. And I think in the tenderness of that embrace, this image captures the hope of moral repair. So I'm very mindful of the moment in time that we're connecting. And for me, I think in this polarized, frightening moment that we're living through, keeping that duality in mind, that ability to, as Bessel van der Kolk, who's one of the leading trauma experts alive today, he writes that our capacity to destroy one another is matched by our capacity to heal one another. And yeah, I'm going to really invite us to kind of keep that with us this evening as we think about moral injury and moral repair. So my hopes for this session to briefly introduce and explore the concept of moral injury, to share a little bit with you about my journey into this work through arts and creativity, and particularly through a Churchill Fellowship. I will present some emerging outcomes from Reflect and Renew, which is a restorative retreat program, so a group intervention that we've been piloting with Moral Injury Partnership and evaluating in partnership with the International Centre here in Durham. I also hope that we can, in this session, create a little bit of space to reflect on how we all look after ourselves and guard our own moral well-being when working in morally challenging contexts. And I put there, i.e. the world, which is slightly tongue-in-cheek, but also absolutely how it feels. I think when Bessel van der Kolk, who I mentioned a moment ago, in his book "The Body Keeps the Score," he writes that when people would book him for a conference, they would say to him, "Could you just focus on the trauma and leave the political stuff out?" And he replied that that was impossible because trauma is political. And I feel just that way about moral injury. If we think about moral injury as that conflict between our sense of what is right and sometimes needing to behave, do, or witness things that violate that sense of what's right and those deeply held values, then thinking in a systemic, political way about how we live becomes really, really important. And I think part of the hope for me is this idea of moral courage. And I think this is where the arts, creativity, narrative, and accessing our stories become a real tool. And this moment, which probably most people are aware of or maybe listen to, when the Bishop of Washington spoke her truth to power from her pulpit at the day after Trump's inauguration, and she asked him to consider those people living who were LGBTQ plus or were undocumented migrants. And I think that moment for me sort of took my breath away. It was a moment of theatre. It was a moment of integrity, courage, and I think has inspired me in the days since. I firmly believe that activism is an antidote to despair, and that arts and storytelling is a form of activism. So I'll be just encouraging you to think about how in these times that we're living in, and as our understanding of moral injury deepens, how moral courage and arts might be able to help us. So a little bit about me and my journey into this work. So I initially trained in drama and theatre, and a few events for me early on shaped, I guess, the direction of my work. While I was studying, I went to volunteer in a Romanian orphanage, and it was at that time in the early 90s, so just after the fall of the Berlin Wall and those huge changes that were happening across Europe. And part of that was the overthrowing of Ceausescu in Romania. And what was exposed was this huge number of state-run institutions where children and young people were living in really devastating conditions. So going there as a theatre student, just kind of wide-eyed and 18 years old, really changed my life, changed my working life, and it sort of helped me to realize that actually where my real passion lay, and what I hoped that I could do to help a tiny bit in this world, was in that kind of bringing together creativity, theatre, with helping people who didn't have the opportunity to express themselves or to have their voice heard, or to really have a sense of their identity. So bringing those two things together. I went on to work in prisons in the UK, and a little bit in some other countries in Europe. And although I didn't know the term moral injury at that point, what I was witnessing daily there, in connecting with men, women, and young people who'd been imprisoned, was people whose life chances, life opportunities were limited by their socioeconomic situations, by intergenerational trauma in many cases, and that actually what we and still are doing was imprisoning and often re-traumatizing the most traumatized people in our society. Now, as our understanding grows, I was really pleased to hear recently about some research that's beginning into moral injury within incarcerated communities, and also in staff who work there. So I was working in prisons through theatre, group work, and developing that work. And then in 2006, my best friend, Karin Diamond, who's an actor, writer, a director, and I've been doing more, I guess, the kind of therapeutic side of theatre work. We came together with an idea for, just at that point, for a one-off project. Both of our grandmothers had passed away that year, and we were really left with a sense of all of those conversations that we hadn't had, the questions we never got round to asking, and yeah, this kind of led us to a place of curiosity about wondering whether older adults might be interested in coming together to reflect creatively on their life stories, with the aim of finding a greater sense of perhaps meaning and peace about their lives, and also with the aim of connecting and sharing their life experiences and wisdom with an audience. So this one-off project, which was our idea in 2006, led to nearly 20 years of work, and as Brian mentioned in the introduction, recently publishing a book about life story theatre, and particularly about the experiences of working, co-creating with so many participants over the years. So this is one of our participants here, Terry, who I've had the privilege and the joy to know for 18 years now. And Terry was someone who had always wanted to perform. She'd always written diaries, letters, stories, but her life experiences had quashed her self-belief. She grew up in the aftermath of World War II in Cardiff, in poverty, in a family that was marked by domestic violence and mental illness. So Terry's sense of the world was that it was a place that she had to survive and get through, not somewhere that it was okay to step out and express herself. So when we first met Terry, she said that for a lot of her life, she'd struggled with depression, agoraphobia, and she said that even in her sort of teens and early 20s, she had always wanted to talk about her life, to make sense of it, but had had the messages, you're being dramatic, you just need to just get on with it. The past is in the past, leave it there. So when Terry joined this first Life Story Theatre project, which invited her through our approach, which was we were beginning to develop then through this combination of theatre, games, improvisation, play, connection, combined with a reflective process. Small group work exercises, things like creating a timeline of your life. So that combination of the social, the fun, the creative, and the reflective and the quiet inner work through that process, Terry and the other participants then create a version of their story, their collective life story that they choose to share with an audience. And Terry said about that, to be able to express how I felt about certain episodes in my life was both cathartic and empowering. And she also said that, I've got some words of hers here. She said, I don't know if it was the darkness, but I felt safe out there. I felt that I could say things that I couldn't say anywhere else. I could tell the audience that I never went to my mother's funeral. I could say to my mother, I'm sorry, I love you. I may not like you, but I love you. I could never have achieved that through counseling or hypnotherapy. It had to be there on that stage. It had to be bigger than me. And I think there's something in that last bit of Terry's words there about it had to be bigger than me, which perhaps makes sense of why theatre can provide a helpful forum for war stories, for people impacted by those huge, sometimes difficult to put into words experiences. So as our work progressed, we were working predominantly with older adults and then in end of life care settings. So working with people who were living with a terminal diagnosis and who wanted to perform their life stories as a legacy before they died. So we became interested in the idea of inviting people who'd experienced conflict and coming home to work with us and to see how whether this would translate and whether this would be helpful. And so this is a picture from our very first project with military families called Abandoned Brothers, which was back in 2012. And at that point, we were, while we didn't know the term moral injury, we were increasingly having a sense that there was something deeper than what the common diagnosis of PTSD suggested. And in working with this first group of military veterans and their loved ones, we learned so much. We're deeply appreciative to them. And just like within all of our life story theatre projects, when when the process begins, it became an arena where it was safe to laugh, to cry, to reflect on things, to share elements that maybe had never been shared before, and to bring that some of those stories to a public audience. So from this project, I became really interested in what was happening more widely outside of Wales, outside of the UK. So I was really fortunate to receive a Churchill Fellowship, which is a fantastic opportunity, if people are not aware of it, where to travel to another country and to immerse yourself in a specific area of practice and research with the aim of learning from other countries with humility and coming back to share that in the UK. So I I had a fellowship to look at ways in which the arts were supporting families and communities alongside perhaps more clinical or therapeutic approaches. And I travelled to America, and I also travelled to Sarajevo in Bosnia. And it was actually 2016 when I had this fellowship. So being in America at that point, when before the election, it was in the spring. So people I was meeting were talking about the possibility of Trump becoming president, but it was being talked about by most people I met we don't really think this is going to happen, but gosh, can you imagine it did? And when I think back now, like, that's quite extraordinary to think how much has changed since. And also, when I was in Sarajevo, I met with elders who had lived through the war, the Bosnian War, and I remember them saying very clearly and very powerfully that for us, it began with language. And before there was any violence, it was the dehumanizing and the polarizing language. And it felt like a cautionary tale. So it's this curious mix of hearing this very, very sobering note there, but also hearing how both in Bosnia and in America, the arts, music, storytelling were being used to as a symbol of resistance, but also of solidarity and connection. So this is one of the projects that I visited, the Telling Project, which was actually doing very similar work to what we'd begun in Wales. So this was really interesting to see, unbeknown to each other, we were working in a very similar way. I also met Roman Bakker, who was a US Marine who also had a love of ballet and dance. And when he came back after serving in Iraq, after leaving the military, Roman said that he realized that what he needed to do was to use his art form to help. He said that he was aware of how limited the message that was coming through the news was, and he wanted to create and convey something that actually captured the complexity and the nuance of what he and his peers had experienced. And this is an image from a production that I was really lucky to see, where Roman reenacted with his fellow performers a real moment that he had experienced in Iraq. And he says, I put it on stage because I wanted to investigate it, to look back and say, were we right? Were we wrong? What really happened? So this idea of involving the audience in the exploration. So which connects with the work that Brock and Latini were doing, which I'll mention in a moment. But this idea of shared responsibility. And that's something which is, for me, is a real thread in what arts and creativity can offer to moral injury. They can help to share some of the weight of what people are carrying. I also visited just an incredible project which was using stand-up comedy as a tool for connection between veterans and community and as a form of recovery. And this was, just absolutely joyous and curious to hear people. I think anyone who's served in the military or worked in mental health or any kind of medicine or really any sort of frontline intense profession is probably pretty familiar with that black humor, the comedy that can be a survival mechanism. So this project that I visited absolutely harnessed that to create release and recovery. So the core discovery of my fellowship was the emerging construct of moral injury. I was in Minneapolis, as I mentioned, and I was describing to one of the veterans who was involved in the theatre project there. I was sharing with her some of the stories with their permission of the Welsh veterans back home, and things like really challenging experiences people had serving in Northern Ireland, which is just across the water from us in Wales, and this sense of disconnect between government orders and what felt right for them. And as I was describing this and the sort of decades-long impact this had on people, this veteran said to me, "That's moral injury. You're talking about moral injury." And for me, this was a light bulb moment. Even before I knew the exact definition, just those words made so much sense. It was a kind of, okay, yeah, something is morally injured, morally wounded, so far away from that medical model of this is a disorder, this is a post-traumatic reaction. So that was the beginning, I guess, of my ongoing understanding of moral injury, and also this idea of moral injury being a spiritual wounding, and I use that term in spiritual, the way I understand that term, as the deepest part of us. So for some people it might be connected to a religious belief or a belief or faith, but for others more that kind of soul level, that core sense of who we are. So for me, if it's the deepest part of us that has been wounded, then talking therapies, reframing our cognitions, while they may help to a degree, are probably never going to reach that really deep part. So arts, communal, creative approaches feel like the answer, not the answer, part of the answer. So Jonathan Shea, who first used the term moral injury, I'm sure most people are familiar, but just in case anyone isn't, he was a military psychiatrist working with Vietnam veterans, and he wrote these two, I think, wonderful books, which are very creative books. Their sort of modern day interpretation of Homer's The Odyssey. So he writes about Achilles and Odysseus and links those epic ancient stories to the modern day struggles of returning veterans from Vietnam. And one of the things that Jonathan Shea said that resonated so deeply with me was he says that a generation of young people, who served in Vietnam, were subjected, he said, to decades of grief and psychological suffering due to a lack of opportunity to communalize their grief. And I just think that when I heard that word, communalize, I kind of thought, okay, this is what theatre can do. This is what songwriting, poetry, dance can do. It's about that. So it's, as Terry said, it's something bigger than me. And Jonathan Shea, in his work and his reflections through his writing, argues for the power of the group, that actually we recover from moral injury in community. He describes the need for, which I just love, the need for social nutrition when we've been morally wounded. So that's his definition, which has become sort of widely used now, is that moral injury is the undoing of character caused by a betrayal of what's right in a high stakes situation by those in authority, leading to the destruction of the capacity for social trust. So destruction, that isolation, that sense of separateness, needing a communal response or that social nutrition. Brett Litz and colleagues later then extended or offered up a sort of an alternative definition of moral injury as emotional and psychological distress caused by perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So I'm sure, yeah, the resonance for that, for the time that we're living in now, is doesn't need me to put into words, really. And then this idea of a soul wound. Edward Tick, who's a psychotherapist working a lot with Indigenous communities, describes moral injury as a soul wound. So often, whereas post-traumatic stress is predominantly a fear response, and that's, that usually how it manifests. Moral injury tends to be expressed more as shame and guilt, anger, this idea of loss of honor and core self, and the idea of being unforgivable and betrayed. So one of the books that I discovered on my fellowship, which has been a wonderful guide to me, is Soul Repair by Rita Nakashima Brock, Gabriella Latini, which offers up such a compassionate and community-based, for me, idea of recovery. And in this book, they describe their process of putting together the first Truth Commission on moral injury, sort of inspired by the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation process, and that sense of us, as the community, the wider world, needing to bear witness to the stories of those who've been morally injured, so that we can share that weight, share that responsibility, and acknowledge that, this is my interpretation, that if our governments send people to war, then we have a collective responsibility to look after them if they come back injured. So when I came back from my fellowship, I continued the work that we were doing in Wales, and that has evolved into an ongoing program of work which brings together community members with military veterans. So the part of the aim, it's called Coming Home to the Arts, is about just not having that divide. And this was a project where we created a homecoming ceremony for several of the veterans involved. Had really difficult, abrupt endings from the military, and what had been missing was an ending that honoured their experiences and their losses. And so we created this and invited an audience in to share it with us. Lots of the women involved had family members or ancestors in the First and Second World War, and they sang, spoke, connected with the veterans, who had a symbolic process of letting go of the weight of what they were carrying, and this being witnessed. Since then, as the work has evolved, one of the other ways in which moral injury is being explored and expressed at Relive is through comics. So this first comic included Graham, one of the wonderful veterans who's part of this work, his story of being involved in an incident in Northern Ireland many decades ago, which has had morally injured him and had stayed with him since. And this is Graham working with a comic artist to communicate and convey what moral injury has been like to live with. And I think in that way of a creative approach, perhaps conveying something deeper than just words, I think this image really does that. And as at the bottom there, Graham says, "I'm piecing my heart back together more beautiful than before." This taps into the idea of post-traumatic growth, which was absolutely, and it continues to be, one of the themes that I see evolving from artistic work around moral injury and co-creation. Actually, that idea of through a process of letting go, forgiveness, that some of that moral pain can be transformed into post-traumatic growth. And this is the latest edition of the comic that has just come out, which is made up of LGBTQ plus veterans' experiences and life stories conveyed through graphic art, through comic form. So what can the arts offer to moral injury? My sense is that they can offer a non-judgmental space that is not a clinical setting and is not a religious setting. It's a kind of middle ground. It's somewhere else. And a space where those ethical, those existential questions can be explored, can be looked at, held, shared, witnessing by an audience, which can contribute to the letting go of shame, which often is one of the kind of the most debilitating aspects, I think, from my experience of working with people of moral injury. Having the story heard by a community can contribute to the healing process. Not necessary to re-experience traumatic events. We know that one of the reasons lots of people find it really difficult to stay with therapy, for example, is that it's just too painful. It's just too horrible to keep reliving events, keep giving them words. So arts offer another way of looking at, reflecting on, reshaping morally complex experiences. Put here a chance to restore and develop the imagination, which trauma often takes away, and a space to create surplus reality, which is a term from Jacob Moreno, the founder of psychodrama, which really is that idea of kind of what if. So, through a theatre project or through a poetry workshop, someone might be able to, for example, go back and have a conversation with someone who they feel terribly sad that they were unable to save, or to change in an imaginary sense the outcome of things. And then crucially, and perhaps, maybe this is the core, I believe, of what arts can offer to moral repair, is that reconnection with others, that really, many of the veterans I've worked with have said that the most painful aspect of moral injury is it's so terribly lonely. That sense of feeling separate, disconnected. And that we know, I know this from my experiences in theatre, but other people will in other art forms, that the camaraderie that develops in a shared creative process, that sense of we're all in this together, we're all vital to pull this thing off. That in itself can be a really transformative and powerful experience. So I'm just going to share with you a short video. I hope that your sound works okay. You may need to turn your volume up a little bit just to hear this. It's just a few minutes long.
I hurt myself today to see if I still feel. I focus on the pain, the only thing that's real.
When a guy that's been blown up in Afghanistan that won't raise his eyes from the floor will suddenly stand up, sing, it's just magical.
It just feels so at home and a really good space to come, and it just really enriches my life where I've had an empty hole before.
What have I become? My sweetest friend. Everyone I know goes away in the end.
Even people who don't think they can sing actually can. I'm sure we've all sung at the rugby matches or even in the shower. It will change you, and it's just a fantastic opportunity.
If you feel alone, I think this is the place that releases that. It is a genuine family.
If I could start again, a million miles away, I would keep myself, I would find a way.
And this last quote here was from a young veteran who joined the project, who had been living in a very solitary way since coming home. Like those words there, I love you all, I do, I love you. I think we could also argue that what moral repair and recovery need is a sense of love and that possibility of being loved and lovable. So this is the book that we've just published this week. While it's kind of targeted, I guess, for people with an interest in theatre, it also explores and suggests ways of integrating a life story approach into a wider range of settings. So and there's also, running through the book, a series of exercises and invitations to reflect on your own life story. So it might be of interest through that lens. And the link here also takes you to Relive's website, where you can order copies of the comic too, if you're interested in that. I'm just going to really briefly now share a little bit of the retreat work that I've been involved with health and social care and a wider frontline professionals. Mindful of time, but hopefully if I can just spend just 10 more minutes, if that's okay. So So while moral injury, our understanding of it has evolved in the military context, it was also talked about and known in the health setting probably since the 80s. But the COVID pandemic exacerbated our collective knowledge and understanding of it. And these words here, as with soldiers in war, we know that when we stop doing, we're going to start feeling, were written by by Wendy Dean and her colleagues in America in the first wave of the pandemic, as they were reflecting on the suicides of 3 of their colleagues in healthcare. And in this article that they published, they made an impassioned plea for, they said, when this is over, we, as in health, the healthcare force, the health workforce, we are going to need time and space to process what we've been through. And if we think of what Jonathan Shea said, that the Vietnam cohort was subjected to decades of suffering due to lack of space to communalize their experiences, then we can see the parallels. And unfortunately, I'm sure we all here know that for health, social care, paramedics, really anyone on the front line, that time just never came. And now we're 5 years on, and that opportunity for people to pause, reflect, make sense of what they went through has not been possible for most people. At the beginning, Victoria Williamson and colleagues from King's College were signposting, these are some of the potentially morally injurious situations that staff are going to be experiencing. And we in the UK, we had, and I know this was true in other countries in different ways, but we had a particular lens. If we think about the aspect of moral injury, of betrayal by those in authority, this was happening by our leaders in the backdrop. I did warn that I believe moral injury is political. Hope that's okay. So also thinking about the disproportionate impact that COVID had on people from global majority and people with learning difficulties. This statistic I find just so heartbreaking that while BAME doctors make up 44% of doctors working in the NHS, 95% of COVID deaths among doctors were from this group. So I'm just naming that so that we recognise the importance of keeping that intersectional lens when we think about moral injury. Jonathan Shea, as I mentioned earlier, advocates for the power of the group in moral repair, and Brett Litz in a recent article says that interventions are needed which create time and space to unburden, experience compassion, non-judgmental understanding, and empathy. So Moral Injury Partnership is a social enterprise that I have co-founded with 2 of the Churchill Fellows, my friends, Sophie Redlin and Simon Edwards. We each had a different Churchill Fellowship, but the common factor was that the power of narratives being witnessed. So Sophie was researching use of Indigenous talking circles, and Simon's work was around post-traumatic growth and moral injury. So during the first or second wave of the pandemic, we just ran one retreat in the countryside for some health and nursing staff, and we used a talking circle as our methodology, and there's a link here to an article which describes our approach. And this was feedback from one of our first participants. I feel like a big thorn that was embedded in my heart has been pulled out. This then developed into Reflect and Renew, which we have been evaluating in partnership with the International Centre of Moral Injury. And one of the, we think, as far as we know, this may be the first intervention that's tested out, bringing together people from different frontline professions. So within our participants, we've run this retreat 3 times now. We have had people who are currently serving in the military. We've had intensive care staff, we've had doctors, social care managers, mental health professionals. And what we're learning is that is a real strength of the intervention. That idea that people are coming together as humans. So while lots of the experiences that have led to moral injury have been in a professional setting, what we're really creating and what we want to develop is this sense of coming together as human beings, regardless of our professional roles. And as the program says here, having space to really ask ourselves, who am I? And how do I make sense of my experiences? We then move on to the idea of letting go, of self-forgiveness and self-compassion. And then on day 3, moving towards creating a roadmap really for moving forward with growth. So the elements of this intervention that are essential are that it's experiential group work. We use ritual and we use creativity. So there is music, there is creative writing, there's movement. So we are, I'll just move through this, just mindful of time. We're just collecting and writing up the findings now, but what's emerging is the sense of I'm not alone, the power of shared stories, increased self-compassion and forgiveness, the relief of sharing and letting go, and new perspective on work and the future. I'll just share a couple of quotes from our participants. I feel as if a weight has been lifted from my shoulders. I have a sense of being more carefree and able to renegotiate my relationship with work and the place I was willing to grant it in my life. I felt profoundly moved by the stories of others and the deep listening that I experienced. I gained a new understanding of the concept of moral injury. I remembered that the moral complexity of my work was why I had enjoyed it. I reviewed my focus in order to protect myself more from harm. And I think in this one, you can really hear that self-forgiveness, where somebody says here, I am more able to recognize the reasons for the difficult decisions that I had to make, and I feel more pride in my working life. So moral injury, as I understand it, is a systemic issue, but often it's experienced by the individual as incredibly lonely, and that someone carries it alone. So the idea of being able to share, to communalize the experiences, and to do so with the freedom and the lightness that creativity offers, I think are what we're discovering here is this is a road to recovery and repair. So we are in the place of seeking further funding to develop that methodology, to be able to offer this to more people as a reflective space to recover, deepen our understanding of self and others. So I'm going to finally stop talking, but I just wondered about ending with this as a reflection, just an offering to you, really, maybe to think about how will we, all of us, guard our own moral well-being as we bear witness, whether this is by being humans in the world or in the work we do, or both, to hurt, wrongdoing, and injustice. Knowing our own core values can provide moral courage. What comes to mind when we ask ourselves, what do I stand for? What really matters? How might we, or how might you as an individual, use creativity for moral courage or moral protection? Maybe you love to write, sing, dance, paint. but I'm just planting that seed. Might there be something there for you? And then lastly, where is your community? How do you connect with solidarity and remember that you are not alone with the moral challenges that we face? Okay, so I'm going to leave that there. And if people would like to connect and stay in touch, I'd love to hear from you. I think we're still in the early days of our understanding of moral injury, and we, as Brian and Jane, are leading so brilliantly in Durham. You know, we're all in this process of learning together. Okay, thank you very much, everyone.